and welcome to Facility Resilience, where we discuss the latest trends in facility design, operation, and maintenance, in addition to resilience strategies for senior management. I'm your host, Jennifer Getz, and today I'm joined by Robert Chandler, founder and principal of Emperiria. Bob will be conducting the first plenary session at the Continuity Insights Management Conference in May, where he will be speaking about today's hybrid work environment, achieving peak performance, and employee well-being. For today's discussion, we will be talking about decision-making during times of crisis. Robert wrote a paper called Anticipatory Foresight and Adaptive Decision-Making as a Crucial Characteristic for Business Continuity, Crisis, and Emergency Leadership, which was published in the Journal of Business Continuity and Emergency Planning in the winter of 2022. And that will be the basis for this discussion today. Bob, in this article, you discussed a traditional approach to decision-making in the midst of a crisis, one that doesn't account for a leader's style, culture, and habits. So to combat this kind of internal influence and potential bias for certain choices over others, especially in some of these tense situations, you discuss this idea of full spectrum decision-making. I would love for you to elaborate more on this idea and about really how to cope under pressure in the midst of rapidly changing and accelerating circumstances.
Sure, Jen, thanks. And I think this is a project that I've actually worked on for several decades, trying to collect a sort of a meta-analysis of looking at decision-making. And of course, I'm now training leaders and executives in decision-making, and I'm actually coaching as well. So this is an interesting topic for me. In short, the traditional approach to the sort of crisis decision-making is a very linear approach. Humans are messy. And a lot of times when you read all these prescriptive books, and work manuals and training sessions, they don't deal with the messy part of humans. They don't deal with the unpredictable part, the emotional part, the, can I say non-rational? I'm not saying they're irrational, but non-rational part of making decisions. And we act by impulse and we act by habit. And there's many things about that. And so if the traditional approach basically said you need to have a leader who's got lots of knowledge, expertise, experience, they should be able to make quick decisions, and they should analyze the available data and make the best decision possible. And it really assumes that leaders are calm and rational and kind of, they're the Mr. Spock, if you will. That's all you have to be. And that's not what we are. We're more of the Captain Kirks out there. We're more of the Martian up there trying to make these emotional decisions and try to sort things out. What I do in this research project is sort of look at the old model, the traditional model, which is this very linear, hyper-rationalistic model, or just make these great logical decisions, to try to begin to understand how we make decisions in situations where it's not just the external information and make the logical calculus, it's the external and the internal. It's trying to recognize our own impulses. And really that's what I argue for. And I argue that many of us use habitual decision models. Psychologists would call it heuristics. And these are things like when I go to the supermarket, I literally don't do a complete cost-benefit analysis to buy a bag of coffee. I really don't. I don't sit there with a legal pad and draw up the pros and the cons. I buy out of shortcuts. What's on sale? The kind of coffee everybody at home likes. The kind that's on the end of the aisle that's the easiest to reach. I use these short term. And most of the time in normal life, nor everyday decision making, heuristics are not a bad thing. They're not something we want to eliminate because they do help us speed things along. However, just doing what worked before or just doing the simple, most cost-effective solution in crisis decision making can sometimes really lead to some serious consequences. The case study catalog is filled full of people who said, well, we saved money, but we destroyed the business, or people lost their lives, or whatever. We now have a product where the doors fall off the airplanes when they're in flight. And in terms of making good decisions. And so what I really have tried to do here is sort of look at training the whole thing. You mentioned full spectrum. And really full spectrum is the idea of recognizing yourself, being self-aware. It's also recognizing the many types of dynamics that some of us are blind to. Thorsten Veblen and Kenneth Burke have this concept that I use in this article, which is called trained incapacities. And basically what it is because of a person who gets training, we become more expert in doing one thing, while simultaneously we create blind spots. And we find that when we debrief a lot of bad decisions, they were just people's blind spots. Oh, I didn't think of that implication. I didn't anticipate that. And so one of the things that I'm trying to argue for here with full spectrum decision making is that we are now more self-aware, we're more situationally aware, and that we're more adaptable. And that's a big part of what my model eventually ends on. And I can talk more about that while we go through this. I actually borrow a little metaphor from Irving Berlin in his little book, which talks about an approach to the great movements of history and the people who focused on one thing and the people who could focus on many. And he uses the metaphor of the fox and the hedgehog. And you'll hear me sometimes talk about be a fox, not a hedgehog. And that's where that comes from. It's just a simple way to remember this. You know, a fox will figure out how to get into the chicken coop. They don't just have one direct approach. They'll have to back up and try again, and they'll go the back way, and they'll wait to a certain time. They'll wait till the chickens are in a certain place. A fox is not just locked in. This is what we must do. A fox is something that kind of takes everything into account. And by the way, is perfectly comfortable with admitting failure. Oops, that didn't work. I'm ready to try something different. Humans who are more hedgehog are like, no, I insist. This is what I'm going to follow to the end. I will be embarrassed to admit I was wrong with my first analysis. And so part of what I'm doing here in terms of trying to train and coach, and I teach we have a crisis leadership entire 10 module, a course where we talk about decision making and several other aspects. And one of the things I encourage leaders to do, in fact, I've just finished a big coaching project, and the questions I get asked to me really come back to this model. Don't just lock in to the one big picture or the one thing that you maybe even your own expertise leads you to. Begin to try to see beyond that.
One way to see beyond that one big picture is by attending shows and conferences that allow you to get a broader perspective. The Continuity Insights Management Conference is the only event designed for senior-level business continuity and resilience professionals. More than 50 educational sessions will feature topics such as business continuity and resilience planning, enterprise risk management, supply chain resiliency, informative case studies, deep dives on artificial intelligence, and much more. Join us at the Continuity Insights Management Conference taking place from May 6th to the 8th, 2024 in Charlotte, North Carolina. Go to continuityinsights.com/CIMC for more information and to register. We look forward to seeing you there. Now, Bob, when you're trying to help leaders identify that they have these blind spots from the business continuity or the crisis manager position in a company, how can they really help leaders and executives get to this point where they can go against some of their instincts to fall back on some of these heuristic decisions?
Well, it's interesting because I always talk about doing executive coaching, and I will often make comparisons to athletic coaching. I'm not an athlete. I have no expertise in athleticism. But I think it's the same sort of project that an athletic coach would do for a runner or a player or a football player, baseball player, track star, wrestling, whatever. Pick a sport, golf. I think every coach out there gets some talented potential athletes. But one of the things every coach will tell you is they often have to teach people to unlearn some bad habits. It's you're not putting the weight on the right foot. You're into the swing is different, and I don't see much difference here with coaching leaders because they'll say, oh, but it worked for me in the amateur league. It worked for me getting to this job. The problem is something that worked before is not guaranteed to work the next time, and beginning to learn good habits. And so I'm going to suggest that you coach someone to begin to build some muscle reflex for some processes, not decisions. I can't tell you which decision is the right one before we get to the next one, but there are processes to getting to it that I can coach someone to do, much like a good athletic coach would begin to say, let's talk about how to do this. Okay to say, I don't know. Boy, that's the biggest thing for most leaders. I just finished a project with a CEO of a startup company, and one of the big issues that we had was he was very reluctant to say, I don't know, because he wanted to be the person who knew everything. And I said, no, the first thing you got to learn is I don't know. And then you become humble. Is that the right word? I don't know if humility is the right word, but you become amenable to other points of view. You actually are listening. You're willing to take different perspectives. You're willing to begin to say, maybe I should consider options that didn't immediately come to mind, and let somebody else even get the credit for the good idea. Great. If it works and solves the problem, you shouldn't worry too much about who gets the credit. I think the other thing about coaching someone to break a habit is again, like any of the great habit breaking things, is you have to really start by contraindicating it. You've got to go a different direction. Again, sometimes it's just parsimony of it, the simplicity of it. Sometimes I'm not going to name the name of who it was, but this same project that I just wrapped up, I had the same CEO would say, I explained myself so so thoroughly, yet none of my people seem to understand it, and they won't tell me they don't understand it. And he said, I've used every technique about being exceptionally clear and direct to the point. And I said, well, let's start with something. What haven't you done yet? And he goes, I've done it all. I said, do you ask them to tell you what it is they've heard? Well, no, you mean ask them? Just start with that kind of thing. And he said, yeah, I can do that. And he said, I thought I was so clear. I was very proud of myself about how clear I was until I started asking them, do you understand this? And they go, no, but they were embarrassed to say that. And I think sometimes that's true with all of them. That's just an illustration of what it is. I think it's a series of reframing and trying to see yourself and begin to look at things that maybe you haven't looked at up until this point. And I think that's probably how to get people out of heuristics because they are habitual. And they're easy. That's the thing that makes them so tempting because, we always kind of do this. When I argue for a whole new framework, and by the way, I argue this is a framework for how we should select people in leadership positions, how we should train them, the entire training program and regimen. And I think it's how we should evaluate people. And in fact, one of the things that I get a lot of pushback on is I think it should be in both the situational performance appraisal and long-term performance appraisal, whether or not the people in key leadership positions are actually enacting this new framework. And I think that's very important.
Absolutely. And one thing I thought was really interesting when I was reading your research was there was a point where you mentioned that research has shown that there's little to no correlation between level of expertise and even experience and necessarily the quality of decision making. So I'm curious, why do you think this is the case? And before diving into this topic, is this kind of something that you expected to see?
Well, it is paradoxical. I admit that. And I think it does surprise a lot of people because you figure the person who's the most expert will make the best decision. And in fact, the research indicates that's not true. It didn't really surprise me because this wasn't a one-time study for me. I've been working on this for decades. And so the evidence is really building to this. It's not what you know. Now, I'm not saying that ignorance is wonderful and that's not the point, but the predictive value is not that you understand how the software works in the background and all of the little bells and whistles. You're going to make the best decision for the IT problem. No, what we have learned is it's not what you know or what it is that your expertise is that is the biggest predictor of better decisions. It's the process of how you decide. Process in this sense trumps. It really is the far bigger predictive area. And so part of this is to shift this, to begin to think. And this is an area we have not paid much attention to traditionally. We have really not talked about. We've just said, make a good decision. Get all the information, make a good decision. And we've not really talked about all of the psychological variables, the habitual variables, the emotional variables, even some of the things. I always do the Mr. Spock, Captain Kirk things. I guess I'm a Star Trek nerd or something, but to me, it's like, no, you've got to understand all of the passion and all of the human emotions, the human element that's involved with it, because we are not Mr. Spock, as much as we'd like to think we are. I love to think that I am. And I think that's part of this. It shouldn't really be a surprise. It goes back to the Irving Berlin model. The hedgehog is absolutely the expert. They know exactly what needs to be done, but that's all they know. And they focus on it. They can't work around the problem. They can't come up with the creative, innovative solution or the way of doing something that was unforeseen. One of the other things that came out of all of that research that I think is telling is just considering more than one perspective of a problem, the definition of a problem, and more than one option as a solution dramatically increases the odds that it'll be a good decision. And in fact, the more options you consider and thoroughly investigate and vet, the better the decision still even more. Now, you say, well, how could that be? Just because I think there's 2 ways we can solve this, there are 3 ways we can address this, there are 4 ways we can address this. Why does that lead to a better decision at the end? Well, it really comes back to the fox again, that it's, if you get locked in and zoned in. By the way, in the article, I quote the 3 or 4 research projects that I didn't do, but I cite them that said that nearly 75% of all critical decisions are one solution only decision, and they only succeed at about a 25% rate. Just comparing that number with the 2 options considered decision, the success rate jumps to almost 65 to 70%. It's statistically significant just by saying, rather than start out the meeting, here's what I think we should do. Let's all come up with reasons why we should do it. Congratulations. This is what we're doing. And by the way, if it doesn't work, the tendency of humans is to stick with it. Well, no, we're gonna follow this through. I know it doesn't seem to be working, but I put a lot of good effort into making that decision. And if a fox would simply say, it's not working, let's try plan B or C and figure out how to make sure this crisis doesn't get worse or this problem gets solved as quickly as possible with the least amount of cost, the least amount of damage, the least amount of loss of reputation. And I think that's why people stick with stuff. I watch all the time these press conferences with people and say, well, we decided early on we should do this. And now, a year later, I guess it was a bad idea. You should be able to do that on the fly. And I think that's part of it. And I guess that's part of this idea of why just being an expert. By the way, the other thing about experts, and I say this with some humility because I'm a university professor and I have a Ph.D. and I run a whole training company where people come to me and coaching company for answers. But really, there is actually an inverse correlation between people who are more expert in a single area to making good decisions. And it goes back to what the Veblen and the Burke quote I said earlier, which is the trained incapacity. The more you see this as a systems problem or a legal problem or a PR problem or a financial problem, the more you focus in because I'm an expert in this and I'm going to see the problem that way, you fail to see it the other ways. Different perspectives are good. Having people with different perspectives, having the engineer there and the operation person and the systems person and the marketing person and having as many different views that, well, you guys know if you do this, I was asked to do a case study on Boeing, and I'm not going to talk too much about that because I haven't finished the research or I haven't published it yet. But, if you could begin to go inside and you say, how does this happen? How do you end up with all these quality control issues? And how do you go from a company that has a reputation of being tremendous in terms of safety and quality control, quality assurance, to one now that's kind of beginning to earn a reputation, deserved or not, but earning a reputation for not being that? It comes down to making decisions. And one of the things that I'm already beginning to find is they called siloed it. They put it in very narrow channels to handle certain things, and they did not get this idea of different perspectives. You need somebody else to come in, and that takes some humility.
Over the years that you've done this research, do you think more people are open to this kind of idea of trying to think outside of these silos? Or do you think the problem still remains where people can have those blind spots that can be distracting?
Well, a lot of this has to do with culture and corporate culture or government agency culture. And when you have superstars and superheroes and we're counting on you and you're the leader of the team. And in a sense, we have a lot of people because they're in these positions, they feel this idea that, well, I have to I have to do this. I have to be in charge. And I think part of it is replacing I know what needs to be done and we're going to do it with, let's be adaptive. Let me listen first. Let me think. Let me get different perspectives in. That's true somewhat in routine decisions as well, not just crisis. Is the person who shows up first day on the job as the new manager or the new CEO or the new, head of whatever. And then they say, here's how we're going to do it. And they don't talk to anybody who's actually doing the job. They don't listen to the people. They're like, oh, Mo, I've already made up my mind. I have so many examples of new leaders that have been brought in because they feel like, oh, I've been hired to do this. I better march in there, give them marching orders, rather than the kind that walks in says, let me listen, tell me give me what you see from your perspective, and incorporated all of that adaptive process. I don't have all the answers when we start with it. I use the word humility is not. The other thing, Jen, that I think you might find very interesting is that the other thing we found is there is no correlation between routine decision-making success and crisis decision-making success. What does that mean? That doesn't mean that good routine decision makers are bad crisis. It's not what it means, nor does it mean, the vice versa. What it means is they're not correlated. They're not the same skill set because you use things like heurism and, simplification and things for routine decisions. So you can have someone who's a great manager in routines that's just completely horrible in a crisis. Vice versa, we found examples of people who frankly didn't have a high reputation for being great, administrative, routine processing, who were fabulous in a crisis. And then we've had people who were tremendous at both, and those who, frankly, weren't very good at either one. Probably didn't need to be making either routine or crisis leadership roles. And so why is that important? Because it really begins to call attention to what I think we're uncovering in this line of research, which is that process is important. In fact, it may be more important than any other variable that we've traditionally thought was important. You're never going to have all the information. You're never going to have the complete, everything is visible to you at the right time. And of course, facts always change in a critical event. But what we can do is teach a way of looking at this that is adaptive. That is, so I don't do any software. I don't know anything about IT, but I steal from other disciplines all the time. When I did the work for the airlines and the pilots, I learned all about, the idea of cockpit resource management and the whole idea of situational awareness, which is now a big issue to me. And when I work with the software folks, the IT folks dealing with crisis, and when I consult with them, they use a word called perpetual beta. And what perpetual beta means in software, and again, I'm not a tech person, so please excuse whatever thing I misstate or don't make it absolutely right. Perpetual beta is the software's never complete. There's always going to be a patch. There's always going to be an update. There's always going to be a version next. You don't ever think it's done forever. They'll never have to update my Office suite again. No, there's going to be an update. Suppose we begin to think about decision-making in a crisis as perpetual beta. This is the best that we know at the time, but there's going to be needs for patches, updates, changes. We're going to have to tweak something. We're going to find a gap that we didn't know was there to begin with. And so I actually, in my coaching, will often talk to crisis leaders or any leaders that I'm working with as saying, think about this as perpetual beta. It's like, you know what? This is not the end of the story, and there may be something new tomorrow morning that I'm going to have to change the way I'm approaching this whole problem. Ultimately, it's getting back to the idea of changing the whole mindset, trying to recognize our imperfections, our gaps, trying to recognize that it has a lot more to do with how we approach the issue rather than fixed, linear, rigid, adaptive, flexible. I guess the other thing I have found is some people think there are born leaders and there are those who were born not to be leaders. And I don't find that as much. It's more like that athletic thing. Yeah, some people are gifted with a few extra talents, but all of this is learnable. We can actually, much like you could train yourself to do just about anything if you wanted to. And to me, that's exciting. We're not just doomed to be stuck with what we have. In fact, the biggest issue I have is going in to work with a client and they say, well, Bob, this is great, but we have to put this person in charge and we all have no confidence that they can do it. And I'm not going to name names, but I've heard that from several people like, well, we have to. They're the head of whatever. They're the vice president for this or that. And one of the things that I take great pride in is that even the people that others roll their eyes about, if they're willing to change, if they're willing to train and do it. One of the other things that we found in this study is that one of the interesting little statistical predictors of people who were better crisis decision makers, one of them was leaders who were committed to continuous improvement. They never felt like they knew everything they needed to know. They said, I'm going to take more training. I'm open. Bring Bob in. Let's talk about this. I want to explore the idea of my team. I want to talk about ways that we can communicate. I want to avoid groupthink. Those statistically tended to be better leaders. Again, not that automatically makes you a better decision maker, but it's part of the idea of rewriting the whole brain, the whole mind and the mindset for how you approach it to say, I can learn more. I can grow more. I'm not done. I'm not going to say, oh yeah, I'm the top of the hill and I know everything there is to know, rather than saying, no, I'm humble. Teach me more. Come on in. I want to read an article. Anyone who takes the time to wade their way and slog their way through my long academic stuff, I applaud them, by the way. We have found that you can actually improve your decision making if you will just shift your perspective. And that's got to be worth the effort.
Bob, thank you so much for discussing this topic.
Absolutely. And thank you for letting me kind of talk about this. I'm actually passionate about this. And I know this is a weird thing to be passionate about, but if it makes the difference in success of an agency, a company, a business, if it saves lives, if it's something that has a good result, or if people can be better performers at whatever they do, then it's worth my effort to do this. And it's not just, people tease me and say, well, it's just academic. Yeah, it is. We do use academic models and research tools, but in the end, it's only important to the extent that people can use this to change and improve and leverage their behavior. And if you're not shifting your whole focus to how you select, train, prepare, and evaluate leaders, then I think you're missing out on an opportunity to get a performance boost.
Absolutely. Bob, I'm so excited to see you speak for the plenary session at CAMC. Thank you to our audience for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode of Facility Resilience.